Hello and welcome to this webinar, MSI Prevention, Preparing for Prime Path 2. I'm Cheryl Osborne, MSI Advisor with Workplace NL's Prevention Services Department. Musculoskeletal injuries, or MSIs, account for 70% of all lost time work-related injuries in Newfoundland and Labrador. Employers are responsible to implement processes to prevent MSIs in the workplace, as per legislation, and for employers who fall under Prime Path 2 to pass their Prime audits. This webinar guides workplaces on developing an MSI prevention program and prioritizing initiatives that drive measurable results and align with Prime Path 2 requirements for Element 13 MSI prevention. A couple notes before we get started. This is a recorded session, so if you do have questions, please email safety@workplacenl.ca and a member of our team will get back to you as soon as possible. There are several handouts provided in the handouts section that you can download during this webinar. There's a copy of this presentation, as well as an example of an MSI prevention procedure that incorporates all the prime criteria for Element 13, as well as there's a sample hazard assessment form, as well as an example of a completed form for a task, and it's just an example task and how you might want to incorporate the MSI prevention assessment into your hazard assessment. There is also a few tools that are provided in the handouts, some tools that can help you with your hazard assessment process for MSIs, like an MSI risk factor checklist and a supervisor work observation form, and also an office ergonomics self-inspection checklist. There's a copy of procedure 507.00 there as well, which is the Prime Path 2 for Prime Path 2 employers, OHS certification criteria. At the end of this webinar, you will receive an evaluation survey that we ask you to complete and provide some feedback, as that helps us to develop better and more effective webinars. And finally, at about 30 minutes into this session, we will take a micro break just to be able to stand up and change your posture, or to sit down if you've been standing statically for a period of time. Essentially, we want to maybe do a few stretches or just have a change in posture to get the blood flowing throughout your body so that we can avoid experiencing any discomfort. Okay, so today's topics. Well, the Prime Path 2 criteria for MSI prevention is outlined in Workplace NL's procedure 507, as I had mentioned, which is in the handout section. So it's outlined in Element 13, okay, which is called MSI prevention. And implementing this criteria will give your organization the foundation for a successful MSI prevention program. So we're going to dive into each part of Element 13 and discuss what's needed to pass your audit. We'll look at your MSI prevention procedure, because there's 4 parts to Element 13. So the first one is your procedure. So we'll look at its purpose and what to include in your procedure. MSI hazard assessment, how to do them effectively. So that is not just a tick box type situation, but rather that MSI hazards or potential hazards in your workplace are effectively controlled so that MSI occurrences are prevented or minimized. Also, we'll look at when to conduct hazard assessments and what has to be demonstrated for you to pass your audit in that regard, to show that these assessments are being done. We'll look at communication and what to communicate to your workers and how to demonstrate that this is being done, and also the education and training component, which is what you have to demonstrate that you're educating and training your workplace parties in pertaining to MSI prevention. So Prime is Workplace NL's financial incentive program for employers, and it's been updated, and I'm sure you're aware of that now, and it includes some new elements for your OHS program. So for Prime Path 2 employers, you will have to have an element for MSI prevention, as I mentioned, and that's Element 13, in order to be eligible for your Prime refunds. So this is the 4 parts specifically. It says that you have to have and maintain a documented MSI prevention procedure with certain things in that procedure, which we'll cover. That you have to demonstrate you are conducting hazard assessments to identify and address MSI risk factors in the workplace. and that you do communicate existing and potential MSI risk factors to workers before work or tasks begin. And you also must demonstrate that you provide training to workers in MSI prevention, which includes at minimum the specific topics that are outlined in element 13. So we'll start with section 13.1, which is regarding the procedure that's required. Employers must have a procedure for MSI prevention that includes, at a minimum, the responsibilities of the workplace parties, and processes for reporting and investigating signs and symptoms of MSIs, as well as any concerns of potential MSI hazards. So your procedure can, of course, include more, but at minimum, this is what's required to pass a prime audit. However, oftentimes you'll see workplaces in their MSI prevention procedure, they'll also include things like instructions for completing an MSI hazard assessment or educating and training their workers. So those are things that are good to have, but not required specifically for your prime audit to necessarily be in element 13 of your OHS program. I do recommend that because the other three components of element 13 require that you actually demonstrate that certain activities are being done in your workplace, in order to really effectively ensure that these activities and practices are actually taking place and they're being done correctly in the way that you intend for them to be done. It really does require, an established process and have a process in writing. That helps to ensure sustainability. If you've got a turnover in supervisors or management and we have new staff coming in, new supervisor coming in, we want to ensure that they are able to have, something that instructs them, something in writing that they can refer to so that they can pick up where things have been left off and continue on. And to be able to implement, what roles and responsibilities they have in MSI prevention. So having things documented, your processes documented in writing, really is beneficial for sustainability and to ensure that you do, you're able to pass those other components of your prime audit. I do highly recommend that you have those processes demonstrated in writing. So that can be in your MSI prevention procedure if you wish, but again, not necessarily required. Here is an example of some sections you might want to include. There is no right or wrong way, by the way, to format your written procedure. You can lay it out in sections like shown here on the slide, or do it in another way that suits your organization. So this is just simply an example. But you want to make it specific to your organization and take into account the type of work that's being done there. There is no one-size-fits-all approach because of the differences in the work that's done from one organization to another and the size of organizations and that sort of thing. So as I said, what is required for prime is number 2 and number 3. Having the responsibilities of workplace parties documented in your procedure, as well as the processes for reporting and investigating the early signs and symptoms of MSIs and any concerns of potential hazards in your workplace. So for the purpose, well, really you define for your organization what you want to achieve from having your MSI prevention procedure or program or processes in place. And then ultimately, you write that there in your procedure. The purpose of having an MSI prevention procedure or processes is simply to demonstrate your commitment to prevent MSIs and establish procedures and responsibilities for identifying, reporting, and investigating and preventing MSIs and MSI hazards and concerns in the workplace. That's certainly what would be required to be included in your procedure to pass the prime piece, the prime criteria. So it's always good to include a statement that demonstrates your commitment to protect workers from MSIs and to help meet legislative requirements for MSI prevention based on sections 50 to 56 of the OHS regulations for Newfoundland and Labrador. I'd recommend including that your organization will do these 3 activities. They'll consult with workers on MSI matters, specifically when performing hazard assessments, workers who are experiencing signs or symptoms of an MSI, as well as a representative sample of workers who are required to carry out the work that's being assessed. Okay, so that comes straight from OHS regulations. So it would be my suggestion that you include in your employer statement or commitment statement that you will consult with workers on these types of OHS matters. And you'll also consult and cooperate with the OHS committee or worker health and safety representative on MSI matters. And you'll assess the workplace for MSI risk factors and implement control measures. So again, these are all legislatively required anyway. So in your commitment statement, it just makes sense that those items, those particular activities be included, that you'll be performing them. So as I said, there is an example procedure included in the handout section. It's an informal, document that's been created just that you can use as a guide in writing your own if you don't have something already written down and you're just looking for a place to start. So that example may be helpful for you to use as a guide. In regards to the responsibilities, and I should say too that the purpose and a commitment statement is also included in that example procedure, as well as the responsibilities. So you're going to outline what the responsibilities are that you're assigning to each workplace party, okay, for MSI prevention. And common responsibilities for each workplace party might include something like this. And this is essentially based on what the responsibilities of workplace parties are anyways in occupational health and safety based on the OHS Act and regulations. So for employers, you might want to list that they are responsible to, or the employer is responsible to ensure a written MSI prevention policy and procedure is implemented and maintained, that they identify, assess, and control MSI hazards in consultation with the OHS committee or worker health safety representative and workers, provide training to workers and supervisors on MSI prevention, communicate MSI risks and solutions. They're responsible to ensure ergonomically appropriate tools, equipment, and workstations are available, and facilitate reporting and investigation of MSI-related concerns, signs, symptoms, and incidents. Oops. For the supervisor, examples of responsibilities may be to monitor work practices for MSI risks and ensure safe work procedures are followed, to promptly respond to reported MSI symptoms or concerns, to participate in investigations of reported MSIs or MSI hazards, provide workers with appropriate training and coaching, and encourage early reporting of MSI signs and symptoms. Responsibilities of the worker might include following ergonomic safe work practices and reporting any signs, symptoms, or concerns related to MSI, participating in training sessions, and using the equipment that's provided for them to reduce their likelihood of experiencing MSI, to cooperate with investigations and assessments related to MSI prevention, and take part in early reporting to support early intervention. The OHS committee or worker health safety representative responsibilities might include participating in the identification, assessment, and control of MSI hazards, so hazard assessments, reviewing MSI-related reports and recommending corrective actions, or as a best practice, you may have them participating in investigations because part of employees' rights is to participate in OHS matters, remember. Conduct regular ergonomic inspections and consult with workers on MSI issues and ensure that MSI prevention is on the agenda during regular safety meetings, evaluating the effectiveness of MSI prevention program. For contractors and visitors, responsibilities could include complying with your company's MSI prevention procedures, ensuring that their workers receive proper MSI awareness and ergonomic training, reporting MSI signs, symptoms, and hazards to the company's site supervisor or safety representative, and cooperate with investigations and implement corrective actions or corrective measures as directed. For the reporting and investigating piece, again, this one is absolutely required to pass the prime audit for element 13. So there must be procedures for workers to report early signs and symptoms of MSIs, which could lead to MSIs if they're not addressed, and for procedures for reporting MSI hazards or ergonomic concerns as soon as possible. So in your procedure, the written procedure, you would want to include, state that workers are responsible for reporting early signs and symptoms of MSIs and MSI hazards. You would want to state who they would report the concerns or the signs symptoms to. So who is the person or what job position is it that they report to? How do they record their concern? For example, is there a standardized form they need to complete? Is it your incident report form that they would complete for any type of injury that might happen in the workplace? And if so, you would document then the name of that form that they would need to complete. Well, whatever the form is, you would need to document the name of that form that they would need to complete. And if they have a concern about a hazard in their work or a potential hazard in their work, what is the process to report that? Like, how do they record their concern? So is there a specific type of form that they would complete for that too? If you have a hazard reporting form, I guess it would make sense that it would go onto that form. So you would include what the name of the form is that you would be expecting them to complete. Then who will do the investigation? So you need to include that in your procedure. Who's going to be responsible for conducting the investigation? And then what are your expected timelines for investigating and implementing controls? Yeah, so, and then another thing I guess you would want to consider too is if there's concerns of potential hazards reported, then does that generate the need for a hazard assessment to be completed? Like that your standardized hazard assessment form, for example, element 2 in prime, path 2, says that there must be a standardized form used to conduct hazard assessments. So I'm going to get to that when it comes to MSI, but just for the purposes of right now, that form may be used for MSI as well, assessing MSI hazards as well. And so if that is the form that is to be used to conduct hazard assessments, if somebody reports a concern, then does this now spark that the team who is responsible for conducting MSI hazard assessments now need to actually take that form and go through the full process of an MSI hazard assessment of that particular task or piece of work. Okay, so if that's the case and that's your processes, then you just need to make sure you document that that's the case. In your procedure, as I mentioned, this is not required to be written in your written procedure. However, you may wish to, and as I said, it does sort of make sense that because you have to demonstrate this is happening in your workplace anyway in order to pass prime, it just makes sense to have your process documented. So you might want to do it in your element 13 MSI prevention procedure, or perhaps you're going to incorporate this in your element 2, the hazard recognition, evaluation, and control element of prime path 2. Or somewhere else that makes more sense in your OHS program in regards to how it's formatted. But in any case, you do need to demonstrate that hazard assessments are taking place. And a couple things that you might want to include in your written processes would be indicating to your workplace parties what has to be documented. For example, like what are the methods that they used to assess, to identify the risk factors? Was it a workplace inspection? Or really, I guess if you're going to write this in your procedure, you're writing down what are the methods you expect your workplace parties to use to identify MSI hazards or potential hazards. So for example, you might want to list workplace inspections, hazard assessments, hazard reporting, observing workers, supervisors conducting work observations, and et cetera, if there's other ways that you're going to identify hazards. What are your methods to assess the risk to workers posed by the hazards identified? And how are you going to control them? How are you going to eliminate or reduce the risk? And how are controls going to be monitored for effectiveness? So with respect to how you're going to control them. An example of something you might want to write in your procedure might be that the hierarchy of controls is to be used for the prevention of MSIs as well, or the control of MSI hazards as well, and that where MSI hazards cannot be eliminated, that the principles of ergonomics will need to be implemented to be able to minimize the risk as much as reasonably practicable. If you're going to write this in a procedure, again, so beyond the methods, I guess you're going to also want to include how to record the completed hazard assessment. So you're going to tell them what form they need to use. Is it the standardized form that's being used as part of prime element 2 for hazard rec? And if so, then you just write the name of that form in your procedure. And when to document, or when to conduct, sorry, hazard assessments. So for MSI, we always want to try to complete hazard assessments proactively, before an MSI develops or is experienced, or before signs and symptoms start. So things like, when a new employee begins work, doing a hazard assessment then. If an employee changes a workspace or a workstation, doing one then, or any time, then of course, any signs or symptoms are experienced or hazards are reported, then conducting them then. Or if maybe an employee brings a medical note forward, might not even be something necessarily work related that the medical note may be for, but there may be an injury or some illness or condition that we might need to just take a look at the tasks and make sure that this worker is able to still safely complete their work and it's not going to cause problems with their specific condition. So there may be some accommodations needed. So again, when it comes to the procedure and having a process in place, you're simply instructing your workplace parties on when they are required to complete these hazard assessments and how often do they review the hazard assessments and update them. For communication, element 13 requires that employers communicate on MSI prevention. So in your procedure, you could write instructions on how you expect them to do that, your supervisor's management to do that. So then again, that just helps ensure that everyone is sort of all on the same page. If you have a number of different supervisors in different departments, everyone is all doing the same consistent thing. So just as an example, you might state that posters will be placed in work areas or that toolbox are to be completed at a certain interval. Some important information that you'd want to communicate to workers and that should be clearly outlined in your procedure would be the responsibilities of workplace parties in MSI prevention, existing and potential MSI risk factors before work or tasks begin, status updates on the progress of control measures after a hazard report is received or a hazard assessment is completed, or after signs and symptoms are reported. What actions are being taken then? So after there's a report made or there's an issue, there's a concern, you're going to communicate what actions are being done. How are you following up on that and addressing it? So you communicate those sort of things. Just as an example, sometimes there might be a longer term, a control measure. You might need a short-term control just because a longer term fix may take a little bit of time because we're waiting for that particular control to get installed or whatever the case might be, or as part of a longer term budget plan. But it's just really important, if that's the case, that you communicate that to the workers so that they understand that they're heard and actions are being taken to address the concern. Education and training. So you're going to outline the expectations for MSI education and training. You're going to outline who must receive training, when they receive it, how often they receive it, like refreshers, who's going to deliver it or what job position title is going to be delivering it, what methods would be used. For example, are you going to use a PowerPoint presentation type method? Is it like in classroom style? What is the method you're going to use? What topics will be covered? What is it that each party is expected to receive and know? And what are your requirements for them to keep records of the education and training activities that they're doing? So new employees should receive an MSI prevention orientation promptly upon hire. And then all employees must also be trained in job-specific control measures. That's before they begin their work, right? So this is usually done at the department level with the employee's supervisor. You're going to provide education to an employee whenever a new hazard or new information in respect of a hazard affecting an employee becomes available. Excuse me, one sec. Sorry. If a worker has been off work for an extended period, say for 30 days or more, it would be a good idea to have a process in place that they receive a refresher. And then you're going to want to provide ongoing reviews of pertinent MSI prevention information to employees. Recommended at least annually. However, that's for your organization to determine what works for you or will work for you. But you want to just make sure that they're receiving any, or you're providing them with any new knowledge and refreshing their skills and reminding them of very important processes that are in place for the prevention of MSIs and what their roles and responsibilities are. Section 13.2 is conducting hazard assessments. So to pass your prime audit, you are required to demonstrate that you are conducting MSI hazard assessments. All professions and all workplaces have MSI hazards. So in regards to what tasks or what work needs to be assessed, I'll leave that to you as your organization to determine, who requires an assessment. But keep in mind that all professions do have MSI risk factors. There's potential for there to be MSI hazards in every profession and every workplace. So I think it's pretty safe to say that it is required for all tasks and all workplaces that a hazard assessment be completed. And I will say too that sometimes people will call a hazard assessment a risk assessment. And in fact, in OHS legislation for MSI, under the MSI prevention portion in sections 50 to 56, it does reference risk assessment. For the purpose of prime is going with hazard assessment. So we're talking about the same thing here, and just going to use risk assessment or hazard assessment interchangeably. Okay, so element 2.2 specifically, element 2 is hazard recognition, evaluation, and control. And specifically, element 2.2 requires that a standardized form be used for recording hazard assessments. So as I had referenced already, that form may also be used for demonstrating MSI hazard assessments. Okay, that's perfectly fine. You don't need to use a different form. Just use whatever you use for your assessing other hazards in the workplace. Just making sure, that it is working for the MSI piece as well. So specifically, what you need to do is show that form. On that form, you need to be able to demonstrate that the MSI risk factors are there that are exposing workers to a risk of MSI. So if you have workers exposed to certain MSI risk factors, that form you need to show to pass your audit that these risk factors are actually listed on that form in your hazard assessment. That form must also demonstrate that your organization has evaluated and ranked the risks presented by those factors you've identified. And it must also document the corrective actions to be taken, the person that was responsible or is responsible for implementing those actions, and a date for completion or follow-up. So if you choose to use a different form for MSI hazards, which again is not necessary, it's not a requirement of prime, but if you have or you feel that it's going to be easier to do it that way for whatever reason, you just need to make sure that for the purpose of prime, it includes the criteria, that form that you use includes the criteria that was just outlined. It's listing the risk factors, it's demonstrating, it's showing there's rankings, and it's showing the corrective action, the person responsible, the date and follow-up, that sort of stuff. But in addition to that, the other criteria that's outlined in element 2.2, which is you have to have the date of the assessment, that it was completed, the date is reviewed or updated. You have to also include the description of the work that's being assessed or was assessed, and the signature of the person or people who completed the assessment. In the handouts, again, just as a reminder, there is a sample form for completing hazard assessments, not specific to MSI in particular, just a generic hazard assessment form that could be used. And also then there's an example of a task that a hazard assessment was completed on, just to show an example of how you might want to write out the MSI pieces on your hazard assessment form. Okay. So when it comes to conducting hazard assessments, as I mentioned, every profession there's potential for MSIs to occur. So of course you can't assess every single task all at once and have a hazard assessment for every aspect of your workplace right at the start. So where do you start? Well, having a procedure in place will help now guide your supervisors on where to start. So as a recommendation, if there's tasks where you already have workers who have experienced claims, MSI claims, that's an indication that there's hazards. So that's one place to start. Maybe conduct a hazard assessment and see if any controls that have already been implemented are effective enough, or if more controls are needed. If workers are reporting signs or symptoms, or they're reporting concerns of potential hazards, then you may want to prioritize those tasks and start there. If you don't have claims, you don't have any reports of signs or symptoms or hazards, then where would you start? Well, you can look at if you're implementing a new process or a new activity. If that's you're just about to start these activities, maybe you conduct a hazard assessment. That's the first one you'd do. Conduct a hazard assessment on that new process, or before changes are introduced to any existing processes or activities, or whenever a new hazard or risk is identified, then you can conduct a hazard assessment there. If you don't have any indications, well, just start somewhere. You do have to have demonstrated to pass the prime audit. You have to have demonstrated that you have completed MSI hazard assessments. In regards to the number of them, that is to be confirmed or to be determined. I do not have a set number for you at this point in time, but just start somewhere. All right, so this is a simple process that can be used for completing an MSI hazard assessment, and just like any other type of hazard. So identifying the hazards, assessing the risks, doing a risk rating, controlling the risks, and then reviewing the control measures. All right, so looking at the identification piece, the process starts with looking at, what can cause harm to your employees. So you're going to identify all reasonably foreseeable MSI hazards. And here's a list of MSI risk factors. These are the types of things that you're going to be looking for in your MSI hazard assessment, okay? Try to identify these risk factors, or whether these risk factors are occurring in a particular task that you're assessing, and then you write that on your hazard assessment form, what those risk factors are. Some methods that you could use to identify these potential hazards might be, of course, if a worker completes a hazard report form, then you look there. A really great way to identify hazards is just standing back and observing the work being done, watching the workers doing their work with the tools that have been provided for them, or maybe the tools that have been provided for them but they're not using, but actually observing, right? So observing their practices, their behaviors as well. And just take a note of the types of postures that are being used to do the work, how much movement is involved, is there a lot of repetitive motions, is there vibration experienced, and that sort of thing. So observations can be really, really effective. And also consulting with the workers, just asking them, what is the challenging parts of your job? What do you find to be more physically demanding on your body or more taxing on your body? What are the things you find more difficult to complete or really don't like to do? Because there's probably if there's things that are challenging for you to do, or you really don't enjoy in your job, that's a sign there's likely some MSI risk there. Reviewing incident and hazard reports, worker feedback, again, as I said, looking at trends too. So perhaps you have had claims in the past, and in this particular type of work, you can look at what were the root causes from your investigation reports. Completing workplace inspections is another way to identify these risk factors. There's a lot of different ways. And as I mentioned, there's some risk assessment or risk identification tools in the handouts that you can download as well to assist you in identifying potential risk factors or hazards in your workplace. So one in particular it's called Workplace NL's MSI risk factor checklist. Okay, so there's a bunch of statements. I think it's 4 pages. There's a number of statements for each risk factor or under each risk factor, and if you answer yes to those statements, then that indicates that that risk factor is present. Okay, so that risk factor checklist is a really great tool to use when you're completing an MSI workplace inspection. For example, I didn't mean to say an MSI workplace inspection, just when your workplace is completing an inspection, it may be a handy tool for your inspection team to take along with them during the inspection to, to look at those statements and see if any of those things are taking place in the tasks that they're inspecting or work areas that they're inspecting. Oh, here is a picture of what that checklist looks like, actually. Okay, so just for force, as an example, lift, lower, or carry objects that are heavy. If that's happening, you select yes, and there's even opportunity to identify what controls are currently in place to bring the risks down somewhat now, but then there's opportunity for you to consider if there may be other controls that can be implemented in addition, or more suitable controls to further reduce that risk or even eliminate the hazard. Yeah, so where you select yes or write yes on this checklist, then that means that that particular risk factor is present. So in this case, if there's lifting and lowering or carrying of objects that are heavy, and you hit yes here, then that means that the risk factor of force is present. And so then you would transfer that over into your hazard assessment form and write force as being present in this particular task that you're assessing. This next tool, supervisor ergonomics work observation, that's also included in the handout there, is really just a series of questions or statements that it's a guide for a supervisor to be able to walk through these questions with their team. It could be at the start of a shift, for example. And these questions are strategically focused on helping to be able to identify any potential hazards that may be in place. So this is a handy little tool as well that might help a supervisor to identify MSI risk factors. This picture here is just an example of a completed hazard assessment form, or partially completed, for the task of wet mopping. Okay, so when it comes to the hazards, it says list all existing and potential health and safety hazards. Well, there's MSI hazards with wet mopping. Hazards to the back, the shoulders, the arms, the wrists, and the hands because of these particular risk factors. Awkward postures, repetitive motions, force from pushing, pulling, lifting, and gripping, and sustained posture, prolonged gripping the mop handle, perhaps because the task is done by, there's only one person who is responsible for this particular work site, and they have to do all the mopping by hand, and there's a lot of it required, and so there could be some prolonged periods of mopping, so there may be prolonged gripping. So that's a potential risk factor. Okay, so that's just an example of how you might want to write it out on your hazard assessment form. Here's another example. You might want to break it out even more. You might want to list, okay, under awkward postures, here are the factors that are contributing to awkward postures being present. Well, maybe the drain that you have to dump the wastewater in is an inadequate height. The worker has to lift the bucket into a wall sink and so that's causing them to have to work at an awkward posture. Perhaps the handle of the mop is too long or it's too short for the worker, and it's causing them now to use an awkward back or shoulder or both posture. So you're listing out the contributing factors. It's not necessary for Prime that you get this detailed. However, I just thought it might be helpful to provide an example for you, because if you can list out the contributing factors, that may also then help with identifying more controls to address the risk factors. And you might also see that, well, with one particular control, it may help to reduce the risk with a couple of the different risk factors. So sometimes listing out the contributing factors may be helpful, but again, it's not necessary that you get into this much detail for the purpose of Prime. I'm just going to check the time. Oh, we are over for a micro break. I had my clock set, but I obviously I didn't turn it on. So we're going to take a quick micro break now. Just if you've been sitting for a period of time, let's get up, move around, maybe do a couple of stretches, go get a refill of your water or use the washroom, but just step away from your desk for a little bit, step away from your computer, give your arms and neck a bit of a rest as well, and I'll be back in about a minute or a minute and a half. Thanks. Okay. So now that we have identified each of the risk factors that are present in a job or task, or have the potential to be present in a job or a task or work that's being assessed, the next step, step 2 of your risk assessment process or hazard assessment process, is to assess or rank the risk presented by those factors. So to do this, we've got to consider a few things. We have to consider the worker's exposure to each of those risk factors. In particular, we need to be looking at, how long is the worker exposed to these risk factors throughout the course of the day or in between breaks. So what is the duration of exposure, continuous exposure and exposure throughout the day? And also, how frequent are they, or how often are they exposed to them? What is the magnitude of the risk factor? So the severity of the exposure. An example is, what's the magnitude of force, right? So if you think about a load that may need to be lifted, they do lifting tasks. Well, the magnitude of force, certainly the weight of the load will factor into what the magnitude of force is. The heavier load, the higher the magnitude of force, or the larger or more bulky or more awkward the load is to handle, the higher the magnitude of force. Another example is awkward posture. So a posture can be a little bit awkward, it can be mediocre awkward, can be quite severely awkward. And the level of risk depends on how awkward it is. So if you just look at this picture here, for example, okay, the magnitude of awkwardness of a back posture, okay? So a person being completely upright, that's considered 0 degrees, okay? There's no bending of the back. Somebody being bent at 20 degrees forward to do their work, that's awkward, but it's not as awkward as being bent forward 60 degrees. And there's a higher level of risk if someone is bent forward 60 degrees versus 20 degrees. Okay, so we're considering what is the magnitude of the awkwardness or magnitude of the different risk factors. And then we're also considering risk factor combinations. So there may be a situation where a worker is exposed to more than one risk factor at the same time, or the particular body part is exposed to more than one risk factor. An example is for someone who is doing a lifting task, if they have to lift the load from the floor because the load is positioned on the floor, it doesn't have handles, they have to get their hands down in underneath the load to be able to lift it. Now we have the force from lifting in addition to awkward postures, awkward back postures, awkward shoulder postures from having to get that load from the floor level. So now we have a combination of force plus awkward postures. And usually when there's 2 or more risk factors present at once affecting the same part of the body, the risk of injury increases. It intensifies the risk, and so the risk is increased. So we have to be considering these things when we're assessing the risk of workers being injured from the risk factors that we have identified in the work we're assessing. So we want to use a rating scale. And this is just an example of a rating scale that your organization might use. Maybe they use it now, or maybe they will be implementing it. This is just an example. Perhaps you have a different process, but just for an example, using the wet mopping case, where we've identified awkward postures, repetitive motions, force, and sustained posture, we're going to do a rating for those things. So when it comes to severity, risk equals severity times probability. I'm sure that's not something that is new to you all. This is a very common formula for assessing risk. So when it comes to severity, perhaps your ranking scale is defined like what's shown on the left down bottom here. So 1 would mean it could make you uncomfortable. 2, it could send you to a hospital. 3, it could kill you or cause a permanent disability today or over time. Sometimes these definitions that are provided for severity and likelihood, people or the risk assessment team may have a little bit of a struggle trying to apply that to MSI. They're not really sure because they don't maybe have a great understanding of the risk factors and how much of an impact they have on a worker's body and risk of developing an injury. So maybe it may help if you can look at it this way, just looking at the bottom right-hand side. Number 1, workers are reporting noticeable fatigue or discomfort by the end of their shift. So if you talk to a worker or your worker is expressing these things to you, then that you may rank that as a 1 for severity. If you're having a situation where there's MSIs that have occurred and workers are requiring time away from work, and there's medical attention required to correct it, maybe they're experiencing physiotherapy and that sort of stuff, then that could be ranked as a 2. A 3 would be an MSI requires extensive medical aid or even surgery maybe, and perhaps permanent disability. So perhaps, carpal tunnel syndrome surgery was required or may be required because of this particular type of work that's been done. I would rank that higher up the scale. That's a more serious type injury, and so we would call that a 3. When it comes to probability or likelihood, you might want to look at it like a 1 being unlikely to occur, 2 being workers are exposed to MSI risk factors daily, but there's no reports or pain, or no reports of pain or discomfort, or no MSI claims at this point in time. A 3 would be that, yes, things have been reported. So there's been pain or discomfort reported as a result of this task, or you do have MSI claims as a result of this task, and maybe MSIs are an ongoing concern for this particular task. Then you would rank that higher as a 3. And so just to get back to that formula, you know, you're now doing risk equals severity times probability, and though whatever answers you get to be the higher numbers are those tasks or those particular risk factors or issues, parts of the job are of higher priority to implement controls. When you are identifying risk factors and, you know, trying to look at controls, it can also really help to figure out what's contributing to these risk factors even being present in the first place, right? So here are some things that you would want to consider. And when you consider these things, well then obviously, for example, if the workplace design is the issue, it's the working reach because, or the working height, we'll say, because, you know, the box is down on the floor. Well, then I think that a pretty obvious control would be to raise the box or take out the manual handling altogether and provide equipment that can handle that load instead of having workers manually handle the load. Work organization. So, you know, looking at things like what is the work to rest cycle? You know, is the worker having to do a lot of physically demanding work for a period of time or for a long period of time, and then there's only a very small amount of rest? Is the amount of rest actually going to give them the recovery that's needed so their tissues can actually, or give them the rest that's needed so that their tissues can actually recover enough? Is their work being done at a very high speed? Does the worker have the ability to be able to alternate between tasks? So, you know, they can use different parts of the body and allow worked muscles to rest by going and switching up their tasks and doing other tasks. Is there flexibility for that? Do they have the ability to be able to take micro breaks as needed? What is the break schedule? And is that enough based on the work that's being done, or do we need to get a little bit more creative? Materials, what's the shape or the size, the weight of the load, the location, how frequently is it being handled? The tool handle design, you know, is the breadth between a two-handled tool, like a set of pliers, for example, is it too wide for the worker's hand because the worker has a small hand? And now it requires extensive force to try to get their hand around and grip that thing to use the tool. What kind of equipment are they using? Is it the right equipment for the work? Is the equipment properly maintained? If it's somebody who's working in a kitchen environment and they're, you know, prepping vegetables, prepping food, and they're using knives and the knives aren't being sharpened on a regular basis, and so they're dull, then they're not properly maintained. And so that increases the risk of using extra force to use those tools. So we want to be looking at the equipment, and is it right and is it being properly maintained? The environment that the work is being done in, you know, is that compounding the risk? Is it extremely cold environments and they're doing a lot of physically taxing work, or extremely warm environments and they're doing very physically taxing work, which is going to cause the body to be overheated? Or in a cold situation, well, if your body's cold and stiff, your tissues are not pliable and there's not good blood flow through the muscles, and so there's a greater risk of a strain or a sprain doing very physically demanding work in real cold environments. So we want to be looking at the environmental factors and whether or not that could be contributing to the risk. And then considering the organization of work, you know, is it possible that certain tasks can be scheduled at a different time in the day or outside of peak temperatures? And we also want to be considering the personal factors of the workers, their size, their age, gender, physical abilities. Do they have certain physical limitations that's preventing them from being able to do this work in the proper manner or be able to use proper body mechanics? For example, do they have a knee injury? And because of the knee injury, they can't bend their knees that well. And so when they do have to lift from lower levels, instead of bending their knees and their hips, now what they're doing is just rounding out their back, their spine, and bending at the back instead with straight legs because of their knee injury. So we're looking at factors like these to see what may be contributing to the risk. So in the example of wet mopping, looking at each individual risk factor, this is just an example of how you might want to rank the risk factors. And the risk factors that have the higher score would be the ones that you would want to implement first, controls for first. So in this case, repetitive motions on bottom. And again, this is just merely an example, okay? There's some external risk assessment tools out there as well beyond Workplace NL that I wanted to make you aware of in case you don't know it exists already or these exist already. This is a pretty simple tool to use and a great one, an effective one. Comes from WorkSafe BC. So in addition to just identifying that the risk factor is present, what this tool does is actually helps you assess the level of risk from that particular risk factor or combination of risk factors, okay? So it gets to the point where it allows you to determine whether it's a low, moderate, or high level of risk. So these tools can be used, if you wish, to help you in assessing the level of risk of MSI in work that you're assessing. They also, WorkSafe BC has a lift lower calculator. So this is what it looks like. And the link on the bottom here can take you right to the tool. But if you simply just Google WorkSafe BC lift lower calculator or WorkSafe BC MSI risk assessment worksheet, it'll take you to these tools. Okay, so in this case with the lift lower calculator, you could be assessing a task where a worker is required to manually lift a box that weighs 20 pounds, say, from the floor to a table 3 times a day. So it factors in, this calculator, it factors in the weight of the load, where your hands are in the more extreme positions during the lift or the lower, whether or not you have to twist your body because of the location of the load or how you have to have your body positioned based on the design of the work area, how many lifts you're doing or lowers you're doing a minute, and then for how many hours a day. So it's factoring in the duration and the frequency of the task as well. Okay, so then we get to the control section, and it's the same as any other type of hazard in the workplace. We're going to use the hierarchy of controls, okay? So we're going to try to eliminate the hazard if we can, and where we can't, well then we want to be incorporating ergonomic principles when we're trying to identify suitable controls to minimize the risk as much as reasonably practicable. So here's an example, or here are some the main ergonomics principles. You want to be making sure work can be done as much as possible in neutral postures, keeping things within easy reach for the worker so they're not having to overreach. Reducing excessive motions of the worker, reducing excessive forces on the worker, working at proper heights, minimizing fatigue and static loading. So like fixed postures that cause loading on a tissue for a prolonged period of time. We want to be ensuring workers can move and exercise and stretch throughout the day or throughout the shift, and that there's a comfortable working environment. So these are the basic principles of ergonomics that we want to keep in mind when we're trying to identify suitable controls. And now then an example of a control might be, providing or changing a workstation that takes into account the height of the worker, making sure that, the worker can work in a neutral position. So, raising the height of a workstation so they're not having to bend over, for example. Providing appropriate clearance for a worker. Perhaps a worker is having to do a fair bit of lifting and handling, but in certain areas there's crammed spaces, and so in one particular area perhaps they can't use proper body mechanics and do a good hip and knee bend to get down to a lower level because their buttocks would hit materials behind them or a wall behind them because there's not adequate space, for example, right? And then finally, the review part for hazard assessment. So if a control measure is not working effectively, it has to be reviewed and modified or replaced. And that's the same as for any other type of hazard. So those are the main pieces, or I guess the important pieces for conducting MSI hazard assessments. And essentially those things that I just talked about would be, those processes, I guess, would be the things that you would include in your written instructions for your workplace parties. Section 13.3, the next two, by the way, are quick sections, okay? So essentially, you have to demonstrate for your prime audit that you are communicating existing and potential MSI risk factors to workers before work or tasks begin. So you need to demonstrate that's happening. It has to be documentation to support that. All right, so there's you know, different ways that we can demonstrate communication is happening. For example, having a poster in a workplace, that's evidence there that you're communicating certain things. For example, you can have a Workplace NL's poster called "Are you at risk?" and then it shows the different risk factors in visual. So we have a lot of different posters that can be helpful for you to communicate on MSI prevention. So having things like that posted in your workplace helps to demonstrate you're communicating to workers. Perhaps you might send an email out about a particular hazard and then keep record of your email. Perhaps you talk about certain hazards in your orientations and then keep records of your orientations. Keep your training records. If you do a toolbox talk on a certain task and particular risks in that work and you're reviewing the control measures with workers, well then keep copy of the toolbox talk, like a record of that. Have it such that the workers' names are written on that toolbox talk record. Another example is if you do a hazard assessment, perhaps use a toolbox talk as a way of communicating the results of that hazard assessment, and then attach the hazard assessment to your toolbox talk record and keep that. Those are the types of things that the auditor will be looking for. Maybe if you have a staff meeting, right, and you talk about particular hazards, MSI hazards, well then keep records, keep your meeting agenda, that sort of thing, or minutes. And then finally, 13.4 is about education and training. So you have to demonstrate that you are educating and training workers on particular pieces pertaining to MSI prevention, which I'll get to in a second. But you have two options. You can provide workers with Workplace NL's MSI prevention certification training. So that's an 8-hour in-classroom course at this point in time, which course offerings are available on the certification training registry. So you can go into the registry and look up class offerings. You can look at service providers or trainers and training providers that offer that course and look for available classes in your area. Some training providers will actually come to workplaces and deliver that as well. But that's not required, okay? So you can do that, or you must demonstrate that the equivalent training to that is being provided. And equivalent training includes, sorry, I didn't flick my slide. So that's the two options. It's Workplace NL MSI certification or equivalent training, okay? So equivalent training is listed in section 13.4 of procedure 507. And it specifically says that this is what must be included. Okay, you must train workers in the early signs and symptoms of MSIs and their potential health effects. In your procedures for reporting early signs and symptoms of MSIs and concerns of potential hazards. So you're telling them that you're expecting them to report these things, and here's how. You're training them in specific and potential hazards and control measures to be used to prevent MSIs in the work they do. So specific safe work procedures that you have in place, lifting equipment maybe that you require them to use, personal protective equipment they must use, et cetera, et cetera. If they must wear gloves or what have you, knee pads. So you're instructing them in specific hazards for their work, okay? That's over and above what actually MSI certification training will even provide, because we don't get into specific hazards for each individual workplace and task. You must also include or demonstrate that you're telling them or you've taught them how to modify their own work or tasks to reduce the risk of MSIs, such as when and how to use rest breaks and task variation. So what are your procedures for them to modify their work? And you're demonstrating that you've given them those procedures. You've taught them that. And also taught them what healthy working postures are, what proper body mechanics is during manual material handling. If that's applicable in their work, you need to teach them how to properly lift and handle using good body mechanics. Okay, so those are what's required to be demonstrated for your prime audit. And who requires training? I think that might be the last, another question that many will have. Who requires the training, and what do I need to demonstrate for my audit? How many people do I need to show I've trained? Well, really, the only answer I can give you is that everyone who is at risk for an MSI requires this training. And so it's up to you to determine who is at risk for an MSI based on your hazard assessments. But if we go back to earlier, my statement about the fact that MSI risk factors exist in every profession and every occupation and workplace, then I think that sort of speaks to the fact that everyone requires training. And the final thing I'll say when it comes to all of element 13, I guess, these 4 components that are criteria that is required. It's a lot. And you may be, I guess, thinking, how can I get all this done in year 1? It's not going to be possible. And what I don't want to happen is for you to just give up and be like, okay, I'll just start in year 2. Don't do that. Remember that you must have a minimum of 65% in every element to pass prime, and a total overall average of 80 or more. So keeping that in mind, that 65%, like let's just look at education and training as an example, right? You may not be able to get every single person in your workplace trained this year for prime, the prime year 1, we'll say. However, that don't just give up and say, okay, well, I'm just going to start training next year. No, try to get as many trained as you can get trained, and the auditor is going to be looking for documentation to support that you are doing training. Okay, so remember that it's a 65% or higher to pass. You don't need to have that 100% to pass. So demonstrate that you're doing the work, you're getting these things implemented, and that's the best thing I can recommend at this point. So finally, if you do have any questions, please reach out to safety@workplacenl.ca, and we will reply to your email as soon as possible. If you would like to get a list of upcoming webinars, then please visit workplacenl.ca/events to get the complete list, or you can just scan this QR code on the screen. And in case you haven't already heard, Workplace NL does have a health and safety podcast called The Signal, and you can join us for each episode as we explore current OHS topics that can improve the health and safety of you and your coworkers. You can find The Signal through your favorite podcast platform, or you could also listen to them on Workplace NL's YouTube channel. I want to thank you so much for attending this session today. Please don't hesitate to reach out to Workplace NL's Prevention Services Department should you have any questions, once again, or require some assistance in implementing your Element 13 MSI prevention. Take care, and hopefully we will connect soon.